Hi, welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Cindy Yu. I'm an assistant editor at The Spectator and the host of The Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast. Joining me on this episode today is Rana Mitter, a China expert formerly at Oxford and now at Harvard Kennedy School. And he's written for The Spectator this week about all the scenarios in which China could squeeze Taiwan short of a full-on invasion. Rana Mitter, welcome to Spectator TV. When it comes to Taiwan then, the conversation is often about an invasion scenario, whether or not it's going to happen, whether it's going to happen by 2027, when it's going to happen if it's not by then. But your piece in The Spectator this week looks at all of the scenarios that fall short of an invasion scenario and things that are being done right now. So can you give us an overview? What are those things?
I mean, it's important not to dismiss the military element. And of course, there are an awful lot of think tanks, political analysts, military analysts in many Western countries who are looking at the ways in which a military confrontation between China and the United States and its allies might be possible in the late 2020s or beyond. So we absolutely shouldn't discount those possibilities. But I think it's not the top priority of the Chinese authorities to try and undertake a sort of full-scale D-Day style military invasion. The major reason being that it's actually very difficult to do in terms of topography. The island of Taiwan will be hard to conquer without a really quite risky sort of amphibious attempt to take it on. So instead, there's been a lot of attention in Beijing as to other ways in which Taiwan might be made more vulnerable. And the two things that I explore a bit in the piece in The Spectator this week are, first of all, the economic tactics, both incentives and coercion, that could be used to try and get Taiwan to push towards unification with the mainland. And also a factor which perhaps has only started to emerge more recently, still very much in flux, but I think fascinating, which is the changing nature of the domestic electorate in Taiwan. In other words, which parties people are voting for and why some of those might be at least more open to some sort of dialogue with China, as opposed to the current ruling party at the presidency level, the DPP, with which Beijing essentially says it's refusing to have any sort of conversations. So those two elements, the economic and what you might call the cephalogical, are really at the heart of the piece that I put forward.
So Rana, let's talk about the economic a bit more for now then, because in the West we often see Taiwan and China as being at loggerheads, but actually, as you point out in your piece, there's quite a lot of interdependence, should we put it that way, when it comes to the two places. So what are those links?
Absolutely. And it depends about how you calculate it, but there are plausible estimates that something like 80% of the businesses and in some ways the employment that you'll find in Taiwan is in some way linked to the mainland of China. So just take one example that's become quite well known. The electronics component manufacturing company Foxconn. It's run by Terry Gou, who is a very well-known ultra-rich entrepreneur. The company's based in Taiwan. He's from Taiwan, but the factories that assemble those components, which are found in Apple iPhones and all sorts of really high-level electronic equipment, they are assembled in South China, in other words, within the mainland of China, the People's Republic, in large factories. And while that's perhaps just one of the more high-profile examples of how Taiwan's economy is tied to the mainland, it's not the only one. Just a few months ago, a little bit before the election, Beijing decided it wanted to try and make a pointed gesture in terms of the vulnerability of Taiwan's economy. And so for a short period, they started essentially doing a boycott of imports of exotic fruits. Pineapples, I think, were on the list, and also chemicals, which actually less glamorous than semiconductors, which a lot of people know are a very important part of Taiwan's economy. But even though chemicals are less glamorous, they are a very important part of Taiwan's economy. And for a while, some of them were prevented, ostensibly on the grounds of not passing certain types of safety inspection checks into the mainland. And this was taken by most people as a gesture on Beijing's side that if they really wanted to make economic life difficult for Taiwan, they could do it quite easily without having to send out a single submarine or plane, just by essentially putting on some tariffs or more than that, perhaps preventing the import of certain goods. And bear in mind, Cindy, this is important because at the moment, Taiwan, like a lot of developed countries, frankly, like the UK, is going through an economic crisis that means that younger people can't find good professional opportunities, they can't afford mortgages, they feel that they're very stretched economically. And in those circumstances, a boycott by China of the economy really makes a very negative sort of difference.
And then I guess the question in a democracy is, who do the voters blame for something like that? Now, you talk about that psychological element as well. Observers might say that, look, the Democratic Progressive Party have secured a historic third term. They are the more critical of the PRC party, of the major party. So why would you say that the electorate is actually perhaps shifting a little bit on China?
I think that's right. Well, just very briefly for listeners and viewers who don't know that much about Taiwan's political system, there are really three main parties in play. The traditional ruling party, the KMT or Kuomintang, Kuomintang is how it's sometimes written in the West, was actually the party of the old nationalist dictator on the island, Chiang Kai-shek, from back in the 1930s and 40s. And after he fled to the island in 1949, he ruled it as a dictatorship for decades. But then in the period in the 1980s and 90s, the party transformed into a fully democratic party. The main opposition party, which is actually holds the presidency today, is the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party. And it is basically a party that's much more tied to the idea of Taiwan having its own identity. Beijing calls it a Taiwan independence party, and there are many people in it who probably do support independence. But in general, it doesn't openly take that line explicitly because it knows that Beijing would almost certainly treat that as a red line for an attack. And there's a third party, the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party. It's one of a series of kind of new third parties that have appeared, disappeared, and reappeared over the years. But it's headed by a very charismatic, some would say slightly sort of offbeat politician. He's known for kind of, making pretty popular statements in some ways, Ko Wen-je. But he is someone who is regarded as a sort of third voice, a fresh voice, who actually, amongst other things, it's thought might be willing to talk to Beijing, and Beijing might be willing to talk to him. Precisely what they talk about is still very much moot. But since Beijing has made it clear that the current president, Lai Ching-te, is someone they regard as what they call a splittist, someone who wants to essentially take Taiwan forever out of the ambit of China. And of course, they want to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. They would be looking for one of the other parties, the KMT or TPP, to win the presidency. And right now, as we've been saying, the economic situation is such that even if the presidency remains in the hands of the DPP for another 4-year term, it will be increasingly difficult for a term beyond that, and also in Taiwan's parliament, for the DPP to retain significant power. So that's really, I think, China's hope that economic discontent will provide a new opening in which, for instance, younger voters, dissatisfied with not being able to make economic progress, might be willing at least to have a China-friendly party that they would see as an alternative.
Could that also manifest in the DPP or Lai Ching-te becoming getting closer to the KMT or the TPP when it comes to its position on China? By which I mean, easing up the China relationship in order to ease up the economic situation to secure another term in future?
I think that that's actually quite likely in some ways, Cindy. One of those things we've seen in the last couple of weeks is a sort of parliamentary manoeuvring, which some of its critics have actually called a coup. Now, that's probably a bit strong, but it basically has enabled the opposition parties, the TPP, the KMT, which actually have a dominant position in the parliament, as opposed to the presidency of Taiwan, to essentially grab more power for themselves to make policy. And the implication is they might make policy that enables more dialogue or possibly economic cooperation with China to be on the table. The counter argument that the DPP have, and frankly, it's a very strong one, is that nobody quite knows what closer cooperation with China would mean, but they look at the example of what happened to Hong Kong just a few years ago, which is a place directly under Chinese rule, of course, since 1997. For about 20 years, it was given pretty much freedom to do what it wanted in terms of free speech, media, and so forth. And then a series of demonstrations by students and others essentially led Beijing to clamp down, and now restrictions have become very, very heavy. Freedom of speech and press and so forth have been reduced extremely heavily. And Taiwan is one of the freest societies in Asia, indeed in the world. It has a very free and lively press, free political parties, lots of space for LGBT and other issues as well, which you don't get even in much of the rest of more conservative Asia. And voters are significantly worried that in the event of a closer relationship with China, that freedom to be able to speak out politically on anything they want would be heavily reduced. And to put it its most basic, Beijing, when asked about these issues, has almost no answer. They would generally tend to move the subject onto the economic benefits of closeness of China for Taiwan, but steer away from the question of how Taiwan's lively democracy would be maintained and indeed strengthened in an alliance with China, because they find that politically an almost impossible question to come up with a convincing answer to.
Especially after what they did to Hong Kong. And it's been reported that Wang Huning, who has been a strategist behind 3 successive Chinese leaders, has been set upon this task of coming up with a new narrative for Taiwan that's not one country, 2 systems. But I think that's a really difficult sell, really, considering where we are today.
I think that's right. Wang Huning, we should note, is what you might call the sort of the propaganda and narrative kind of weaver of stories for the Chinese Politburo. He's actually a former professor, and he's in charge of trying to put together the idea of what the new China is supposed to be. You know, the great Chinese Renaissance is a phrase that the Communist Party, likes to use about China's future. And Wang Huning is very much someone who's been given the nod at the top level in terms of telling that story. And to do that successfully, he is indeed, I think, one of the people who's supposed to come up with a narrative that suggests that for Taiwan, being unified with the mainland would in some way be a positive and advantageous thing. Now, prior to the national security law in Hong Kong, the argument would have been, well, you can see that we're able to run a system by which the mainland is, pretty restricted in terms of freedoms, but Hong Kong is allowed to carry on as it wants. Now that that's no longer the case, the story for Taiwan is much harder to construct. And we should note that Wang Huning, this particular person who is in the standing committee of the Politburo. This is the top 7 leaders of the whole of China, all of the men, we should point out, of course. Way back in the early 90s, I think 1991, wrote a book called America Against America. This was written after a visit to America where he became increasingly convinced that America was going to become a highly polarized society. Now, that may not have been so true in the 1990s, but one has to say in some ways, of course, his insight has a certain amount of substance today. So perhaps we shouldn't underestimate his capacity to be able to analyze political events. But I'd say that coming up with a story that's going to convince Taiwan's electorate that getting close to the mainland is a benefit for them, that is a tough task. And so far, we don't have any very clear vision of how he's planning to actually express that idea.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that on the Taiwan question, it's very difficult to have black and white. So when we talk about Taiwanese voters thinking about their economic pressures, it's not that they want to be so much closer to China, but it's also not that they want to be so much further from China either. So there's many shades of grey here. And Rana, just finally, let's talk about America's polarization then, because at the end of this year, we may very well be seeing a President Trump coming back into the White House. What does that mean for Taiwan?
In some ways, I suspect that China policy may not be that much different if there were a second Trump presidency as opposed to a second Biden presidency. And as we know, the opinion polls suggest it's very, very close at the moment. We just don't know which way it's going to go. But some of the figures who are most associated potentially with a new Trump administration on China policy, such as Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, very expert on China, and spent many years there as the Wall Street Journal's correspondent. He's been writing in Foreign Affairs, the journal, and also I think he has a book coming out, which argues that a very strong defense of Taiwan by the US is necessary. So does Elbridge Colby, another figure, tipped for a strong national security role potentially, who argues again that Taiwan is a strong national security interest for the United States. Well, the current Biden administration also makes it very clear that it regards the democratic future, but also the nature of Taiwan as a security issue as very important for America's Asia policy as well. So while I'm sure that a Trump presidency would be very different in all sorts of ways from a Biden presidency, on the question of East Asia, actually there may be more convergence than on some other foreign affairs issues, such as Ukraine. But of course, in a few months' time, we will know either way.
Rana, that's really interesting. And I guess whether it's Biden or Trump, they're going to have to think about what to do if China squeezes Taiwan in these kind of grey area ways rather than a full-on invasion. Rana Mitter, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.